Good morning and welcome to Office Hours of Avalara. I'm Wayne Myer, software engineer here at Avalara with developer relations. And in the room today, I've got India Anderson, the Connectors Program Manager, and Jeff Meisner, Senior Developer Marketing Manager. I actually kind of wanted to float a question before we jumped into things. India, what is a connector?
A connector is like an app that connects your accounting system or your shopping cart to the Avalara service.
Any accounting system?
You can make it one for any accounting system using our API, absolutely, yeah.
And what are some common systems that we already have connectors for?
Well, Avalara has connectors for over 600 integrations. The ones that we make ourselves are mostly Microsoft Dynamics products, so like Microsoft Dynamics AX, Microsoft Dynamics GP, and then we also make quite a few connectors for various Salesforce shopping carts and various Sage and Intuit products.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
We get a lot of questions about connectors, and oftentimes the people asking for support for their connectors. Are there any connectors we do in-house that we support directly?
We support the Microsoft Dynamics GP, Microsoft Dynamics AX, Microsoft Dynamics Nav, Salesforce, CPQ+, Sage 300, Sage 500, Sage, many. So we actually make 30 connectors.
Okay, thanks. Connectors are a common question here that we get in developer relations, and a lot of times they're black boxes to us.
Right.
And we want to be able to answer developers' questions, and it's good to know which ones we can answer internally. Okay, moving on. Last week we discussed sales orders and sales invoice. Pretty much invariably, if you have sales, you're going to need refunds at some point. Well, turns out the AvaTax team has foresaw this need, and we have a Refund API. And let me show you that in our documentation. We have a convenient Refund Transaction API. The Refund Transaction API is really just a shortcut to create a return invoice. And by using this, you quickly refund either an entire transaction, partial, or that is line item, or tax only. There's a fourth kind of refund transaction that you can do called percentage. Maybe your customer brought a coupon to you after the fact. So India, are refunds fully supported in the connectors that we create?
Refunds are fully supported in most of the connectors we make. We actually make connectors for some systems that do not have a refund process because they're designed for another purpose. The Microsoft Dynamics CRM, for example, there's not really a refund process that occurs in the connector. In the connector because there's not one that occurs in the ERP because it's really more of a customer management service system than it is a true accounting system.
Okay, great. So when your customer has items to return, probably the easiest, depending on your workflow, will be the refund transaction. And let's actually just jump into an example here. With my handy dandy Postman, I'm going to create a basic transaction selling yarn to Irvine, California. And this is actually the code example that you'll see in our Swagger interface and in our documentation. So let's send this, let's create this transaction, and we get back a response. Well, maybe a few minutes after this order, your customer decides they have some buyer's remorse and they want a refund. Now I sent this transaction in committed basically is the equivalent of, yes, we've got this transaction is finalized. Maybe you have a different reconciliation workflow that you only reconcile your transactions, say, at the end of the day, or nightly, or weekly, in which case you would set commit to false until you've done your reconciliation process. So let's refund this transaction, and we're going to the refund endpoint. Default was my company code here, and this GUID was a transaction ID that I just copied. Oops. Let me make sure I actually copy it first. In the response, code is your transaction code. And we're going to refund this. Now notice I had refund transaction code blank here. Refund transaction code, this is for your own accounting system, accounting service. This can be any string that you want. Maybe it's my new puppy's name. Now if I try to refund this transaction, I've already refunded it, but now it's got a code. If I try to refund this transaction again, let's create another new one. And I use that refund transaction code again, still my new puppy's name. I get a doc status invalid. Well, if you use refund transaction code, while it is an optional string, this has to be unique within your company. We'll say it's my new puppy's name too. This dog is going to hate life. And now I can actually refund that transaction. Jeff.
Yeah, Wayne, we have a question.
Yeah.
How do I refund only part of a transaction?
Ah, okay. Fortunately, AvaTax gives you an option here, and we can set refund type in the refund post. Let me create a new transaction. Let me grab that transaction code. Big gnarly GUID. And let's try to just do a partial and see what happens. Well, when we send a partial refund, we actually have to designate which lines we want to refund. And let's put in a refund line now. And we can check this out. Refund transaction model. Refund lines. This is an array of strings. So let's go back. And I'm doing all this in JSON, but this is fully supported in our SDKs, which will save you the trouble of entering in strings, having to deal with JSON. And we want to refund line number 1. And while I'm putting this together, will this work for me? Still didn't like that. And I have to do, I thought I had a good example of the partial.
Now, I see that the transaction code is still listed as my new puppy's name, too.
Oh, that'd be a good one. It's also why we're having problems. Thank you, India. Again, the SDK might save you a little bit of this trouble. But here we did a partial refund for just that line. So thanks for that question. So wait, what if I actually lost the transaction? Well, turns out because a refund is just a shortcut to a return invoice, we can lock the transaction, which means it's been reported to your tax authority, and it creates a negative return invoice. Let's go back and create our basic transaction again. Grab our document code. And now, let's lock this transaction. We set it is locked to true. And now our transaction's locked. Now I'm going to try to refund, do a return invoice, and we'll call this return on locked, and a full refund. And we were able to create the return invoice. So last week we also discussed sales orders. You can also do return order, which is similar. It does not commit the transaction, it's just an estimate. Maybe you're estimating how much you want to return, you're doing a partial return. Maybe a particular use case that comes up. Actually, I think we have a question about tax exemption use cases.
Yeah, the question is, what if my customer gives me a tax exemption certificate after the transaction is completed?
Perfect. So we've actually foreseen this situation also. We're going to, let's say, this person who's buying all of this yarn in California and keeps getting refunds, furnishes us a tax exemption certificate after the fact. We go in, and instead of a partial refund, we're going to designate this tax only. And we put in our document ID in our request URL, and our reference code is tax exemption certificate furnished. And now I'm up to my fourth puppy.
Not nearly enough puppies.
No? How many would be the right number?
At least 5.
That's a lot of puppies.
Uh-oh. The tax override cannot be applied. Sign of line level tax override should match the sign of line amount. Well, how do we fix that? And I had a code example here. Well, I'm pulling that up. India, how are refunds in connectors? Are they handled similarly, or do you see that in the CRM?
Refunds are handled in connectors, however the accounting system works. So most accounting systems that we make connectors for have a particular particular refund document that's created, so it would be a return invoice. And that return invoice would typically have all of the items from a sale listed, all of the items listed on it. It would be processed just as refunding the document with a unique document code for the return invoice, because they would be posting that to our service, just like they post their documents for sales. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to have to loop back to this one. That was a good question that caught me unawares. And so something, a question I fielded last week. If my refund transaction code can be any string of text, how does AvaTax know? I touched on this earlier. Turns out it's this GUID in the request URL for the refund. And we get that GUID. It's the second line that comes back in the response, the transaction response model. It's under code. And by passing in your company code, which also has to be unique in your account, and passing in this GUID of the transaction code, it pretty easily represents the document to refund. And moving on. Jeff.
Yeah, we're getting another question. How do I deal with refunds after they have been reported to the tax authority?
Okay, so once it's been reported to the tax authority, it's been locked. And let me back up here. This locked transaction, this is only available to AvaTax Pro users, people with an AvaTax Pro subscription in your sandbox. This is for simulating your workflow if you're developing your own integration. When a transaction is locked, it's been reported to your taxing authority. You can still file a return invoice on a locked transaction. And I demoed that before, but since the question came up, let's demo that to show that we can indeed do a return invoice on a locked transaction. And this creates a negative tax liability for you. Your accounting system, your accounting process, and your taxing jurisdiction may have different ways of handling this, and your transaction may get carried over to your next taxing period, tax reporting period. That's something you'd have to consult with your accountant and your taxing jurisdictions. But you can still always create a return invoice. Oh, because I already used this transaction code. And away we go. Okay. Let's see here. Another question that I got last week was, what is the difference between a void and a refund? Well, a void sets the document status to canceled. This only works if the transaction hasn't been locked. And let's pull that up. We'll create a basic transaction again. And if we lock it, and now we're going to try to void it. And all of these documents, all of these endpoints are laid out in our developer.avalara.com website. And this documentation is kept up to date. It's generated off of the REST API. So we see here that our void URL is company code, transaction code. I got my handy dandy default company. So now if I try to void this, okay, if I actually can copy and paste properly, and I include my model for voiding. We get back the message that this document is locked and is not available for modification. So in this case, we would actually have to do a return invoice, aka refund. And always using a unique transaction code. You don't have to use the refund transaction code. If it's blank, this refund will go through. Okay. Any further questions? Anyone? India, anything you'd like to add?
I think that's just such an excellent feature. You know, instead of having to do a query and you finding all of the lines and information directly, just being able to use the Refund API is so much easier.
This one, we seem to get questions in cycles in the developer relations team. And the refund and voiding of transactions was a salient topic in the past week. Which was interesting to follow on from that we had the sales order and sales invoice comparison. Let's go, you know, if you got sales, you probably have refunds and voids. And I'm pretty happy, and a couple of the customers I spoke to were pretty happy to have this refund transaction because they're often getting their certificates after the fact. Mm-hmm. Oh, wait a minute, I'm tax exempt and here's why. So we make this pretty easy. Any further questions? Well, no one else has anything to add. I'd like to add that we do have SDKs to simplify this, and we build them in C#, PHP, Java, and you can see JavaScript, our new Python SDK, and Ruby. And the developer relations team has built the Python SDK. Pretty happy. I want to give my teammates a shout out to that one. And I'm working on I myself maintain the Java SDK. These are released shortly after REST goes live, and they are available for you to simplify your integration with AvaTax. Also coming up is May 10th and 11th, Crush DC, our Crush conference with, and we have a dedicated developer track that you can find off of the developer avalara.com website, Avalara Crush Conference, where you'll be able to work with Ted Spence, who's director of the AvaTax API team, and Mark Wilhelm, director of Avalara's partner launch team. We also provide community forums for you to get support. The developer relations team, as well as other employees within Avalara, monitor these forums, and we try to get you prompt answers to your questions during business hours Pacific time. And finally, for support, you can also contact your account manager, who will direct you, will either be able to answer your questions or direct you to internal resources to help you get your integration working. Well, I think we've had enough for today.
One other support option is obviously the weekly office hours with AvaTax call, which is 10 a.m. Pacific time every Tuesday. There's a variety of topics we cover, but we're always open to answering questions. This is a great opportunity to talk to engineers, not quite face-to-face, but have direct access to them once a week. So do take advantage of it.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. Hope to see you next week. Thanks, and thank you for listening.